Okay. Yeah, let's begin, and others can join us as they arrive. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our program, Real News, Teaching Journalism in the Classroom, the second in a series of 6 public programs presented in conjunction with the 2021 Summer Writers Institute. My name is Sylvia Sukop. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am director of this year's institute. For the past 25 years, the Summer Writers Institute at WashU has been a place where writers gather to jumpstart new creative explorations, hone their craft skills, and build community among fellow writers. Our mission extends beyond the high quality instruction delivered by our diverse award-winning faculty to provide a welcoming, inclusive, and affirming space for writers of all backgrounds and ambitions. When I first began in the depths of our pandemic winter to put this summer public program series together, I wanted to accomplish 3 things. I wanted to open up important conversations about the vital role of writers and writing in helping us to understand the world and to change it. I wanted to lift up voices and perspectives that we don't often get to hear. And I wanted to bring the expertise of writers across genres to our wider community, addressing needs and concerns across generations. Today, we turn our attention to educating young people about journalism, what is often called the first draft of history. How can we help them to become more critical consumers of news and to become active creators of news, shaping narratives that can impact their communities? So here's the plan for this session. I will introduce our presenter and then turn the screen over to her. And then I will come back together with her on screen to take your questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to type in your question at any point along the way. You don't have to wait until the Q&A begins. And please don't post your question in the chat, but use that Q&A button. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. Erin Sucher-O'Grady is Missouri Director of the Journalism Education Association and leads the Student Journalism Program at Clayton High School. Clayton's news program is anchored by the award-winning news magazine, The Globe. In 2017, the Missouri Journalism Education Association named her Missouri Journalism Teacher of the Year and a Columbia Scholastic Press Association Distinguished Educator in 2018. She holds a BA from the University of Missouri School of Journalism and an MAT in Communication Arts from Webster University. In 2020, she completed her MA in American Culture Studies through University College here at Washington University. Erin's thesis project investigated, with the help of her student journalists, the interconnected nature of race-based housing policy in St. Louis and the voluntary student transfer program. I was honored to serve on Erin's thesis committee. Erin lives with her wife and 3 children in the St. Louis area, and I'm so delighted that she is here with us today. So please join me in welcoming Erin Sucher-O'Grady.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. I want to say thank you, first of all, to all of you all for taking some time on your Sunday to be here. And hopefully the presentation that I prepared, you guys will walk away with some new insights and ways to think about journalism, information more broadly, and a lot of these issues that we face as a global community. Hopefully I will try to hit all of the things that were described in the session description. The presentation is going to be probably lean a little bit philosophical in nature. So my thinking was to sort of go broad, and then I have a resource document that I put together that I can share with you guys at the end. And then my understanding is that we will also be able to email that out to folks if there are specific activities, lessons, thinkers that I reference that you would like to dig more deeply into. So you can have the opportunity to do that at a later date. So give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right. Can you guys see that? Hopefully. Okay. So hopefully you can see some version of me in the presentation. So where I would like to start this conversation is I want to pull us back and offer a framework for this. And as we kind of move through the presentation, I'm going to offer a few different frameworks for thinking about some of these issues. And I encourage you, if you're a teacher, to maybe use some of these frameworks for leading discussions with your students. I've had a lot of success getting them to think about different issues in different ways, kind of using some of these frameworks. So the first one is I'm going to give credit to Yuval Harari's work. Some of you guys might be familiar with him already. He wrote the best-selling book Sapiens, a follow-up called Homo Deus, and then his third book is called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And those books shaped a lot of my thinking about some of the topics we're going to cover today. In particular, the most recent book, the 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, has some fantastic chapters that deal with issues around democracy, journalism, nationalism that would be very relevant to use with journalism students. So in honor of Yuval, I want to pull us back to Homo sapiens. So the human animal. Why of all other hominid species, why did Homo sapiens win out? What makes the human being distinct from all other animal species? And the answer is two things. So the first is that humans think in stories rather than facts, numbers, or equations. And the simpler story, the better. The human ability to tell stories and to pass on information over time, which is then built upon over generations, and that technology is able to advance and human history is able to advance, is a distinct characteristic of Homo sapiens. And this distinguishing quality that is unique to Homo sapiens has allowed for our domination, for better or worse, of the planet. The second thing that makes human beings a unique animal is our ability to cooperate on a mass scale. So humans control the earth because we're the only human that can cooperate with flexibility and in very large numbers. Humans do not have to know each other personally in order to cooperate. And this is a result of our ability to tell stories. It is our ability to believe in common stories that allows this cooperation to happen. So for example, when we think about a nation, that is a common story that we are telling each other, and that we all believe in. So, and because of that, we all take some money and we pay taxes to support the good of the whole. And if we were in our normal like hunter-gatherer tribes, we wouldn't necessarily be giving up resources to other tribes, but it's that common story that we all believe in that allows us to do that. Again, and another story that we tell ourselves that we all believe in is democracy. And that's obviously really important when it comes to work around journalism. And I'll come back to that in just a second. But to offer you an example of another story that we all believe in that I sort of think illustrates the point is the idea of an economy. So this is an example that Harari uses in some of the presentations I've seen him give. And he talks about the wonder that is the grocery store and how it is an unbelievable example of human cooperation. So human being, I'm going to go into the store to buy bananas, for example, which is something of inherent value to a human animal. It's nutrition, sustenance. And I'm going to offer in exchange for this thing that is obviously of value to the human animal, paper money, or maybe, I swipe a plastic card and then, things happen in the internet world. But from an animal perspective, this has no inherent value. And I can go into the grocery store and I can exchange the bananas for the plastic or the paper with a complete stranger. And we do this because we all believe in the same story. Everything we are as a modern species is really just a belief in a common story. So democracy, to go back to the idea of democracy and pulling in journalism. So democracy is a story that we have told ourselves as a nation. All nations tell their own stories about who they are and what they believe in. In America, we believe that democracy is the best, perhaps, maybe not always the most functional, but yet the best way to govern a country. Because we all believe the same story about democracy, and that we believe that in America, we have accurate and fair elections, which is obviously not something that is a given throughout the world. This shared belief allows us to have order. And this is part of the reason that the suggestion that the most recent presidential election was fraudulent is such a dangerous precedent, because it destroys all the underpinnings of this common story that we have free and fair elections in America. And it denigrates that common story that keeps us all, that functioning democracy, moving forward. One of the most unique things about America, also up until recently, was this history of peaceful transfers of power. And if you do not believe in the common story, so for example, if you believe that the game is rigged, so to speak, you may disengage, or even worse, you might take up arms to fight for perceived justice or to fight injustice, like we saw on January 6th. So the problems we face. So, and this is from a journalistic lens, I think many of us worry that perhaps we're living in a post-truth society. And I obviously believe that that concern has merit. And there's obviously very much to lament about our modern media ecosystem. In the United States, I think we feel this particularly acutely ever since the rollback of the Fairness Doctrine. But what has transpired is that media is now tailored to suit our tastes and reinforce what is easy and what we already believe. We listen to views that make us feel good instead of ideas that make us think hard. As Ted Koppel says, he says this about the news today, which is, we used to give people the news they needed to be informed citizens. Now we give people the news that they want. But maybe to offer some comfort, to quote Harari, in fact, human beings have always lived in the age of post-truth. Homo sapiens is a post-truth species. So our power depends on creating and believing fictions. Ever since the Stone Age, self-reinforcing myths have served to unite human collectives. So indeed, Homo sapiens conquered this planet thanks above all else by our unique human ability to create and spread fictions. For millennia, much of what passed for news and facts in human social networks were stories about miracles, angels, demons, and witches, with bold reporters getting live coverage straight from the deepest pits of the underworld. So take comfort in the fact that what we are experiencing is not new. It doesn't, however, make it any less distressing. For some advice on how to survive in our modern media landscape, the first suggestion is to pay for the news. If you want reliable information, you have to pay for it. And if you get your news for free, you are the product. Because what we live in currently is the attention economy. So the first time I heard this term, the attention economy, was listening to a talk that was given by Tristan Harris. He's a former Google executive who ended up leaving to start the Center for Humane Technology. And if you've seen the film The Social Dilemma on Netflix, you might be familiar with him. And I love this quote: "Free is the most expensive business model. The subtle change in our beliefs, behavior, and identity, that is the product. The ability to shape what we are thinking, feeling, and doing is the thing being sold." In the film, the line that is used is that if you don't pay for a product, you are the product. And I think most of us understand this to mean that if you are, I apologize, I've got a baby crying in the background. I think she'll move into another room here in a minute. Okay, sorry about that. So the idea that if you don't pay for the product, you are the product. I think most of us understand that to mean that if you are using a product for free, you are accepting the fact that you are going to be advertised to. But unfortunately, the reality is a little bit darker than that. It is actually that if you get the product for free in exchange for your attention and your engagement. And unfortunately, the more outraged people are, the more engaged they become. The more emotional you are, the more valuable you become as a consumer to be advertised to. So the goal of these platforms is to get you to spend as much time as possible on their platform. Currently, 30% of all adult Americans get their news primarily from Facebook. So, that's a perfect example of a media platform that's, spreading what maybe looks like journalism And a lot of our population is going to that to consume news, and that's also causing that self-reinforcement of like reinforcing those already previously held beliefs because they want to keep you on that platform as long as possible. It's baked into the business model to make you feel emotional, obsessed, and unable to disconnect. So again, just thinking about that, free is really the most expensive business model when it comes to our democracy and humanity. The other major problem that we face is, I call this that we're in the dark ages of too much information, that people don't really know what to believe, or there's just too much information, so maybe they just shut it all off. Part of the problem with this is that because of our fractured media landscape, because there's so much content, is that we have fewer common experiences, and as a result have divergent realities and media ecosystems that just reinforce our previously held beliefs. To go back to Harari, so this is a quote that I think is really relevant for educators to be thinking about, which is, in such a world, the last thing a teacher needs is to give students more information. They already have far too much of it. Instead, people need the ability to make sense of information, to tell the difference between what is important and what is unimportant, and above all, to combine many bits of information into a broad picture of the world. And what is great is that, in my mind, that journalism happens to be the perfect vessel for this kind of instruction. Okay, so why teach journalism, or how can we use journalism to teach some of these really essential 21st century skills that we want human beings to have? Most scholars seem to agree that the four most important big ideas that we could be or skills that we should be teaching students is this idea of the 4 C's. So it's critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. And if you have a strong journalism program, you're going to be able to really develop all of these skills, or give people opportunities to develop these skills. The other quote that I included in here is this idea of to survive and flourish in a world that is constantly changing, you're going to need a lot of mental flexibility and great reserves of emotional balance. The thing about emotional balance and resilience, and I see this as an educator I've been teaching for 13 years, and my wife is an emergency room doctor, and I know she sees this often. She works both on the pediatric side and the adult side, but something that we are seeing a lot of is that we are not imparting young people in spades with, in our current culture, with emotional resilience and mental flexibility. So there's, we have, obviously, I think we all kind of know this, but there's, the skyrocketing numbers of young people suffering from anxiety, depression, being admitted to hospitals for suicidal ideation, things like that. And to me, it seems fairly plausible to consider the correlation of these issues with the rise of disruptive technologies in our lives. We are increasingly living our lives through these small bites of connection, these like a like or a text, rather than being able to have deep conversations that require vulnerability and trust. So for example, if you have a friend that is having a hard time, if you text that person, hey, how are you hanging in there? They might respond, I'm okay. But if you actually pick up the phone and call, or you go over to their house, you're gonna have a much richer dialogue than just that simple text. And my worry is that these connections, rather than conversations, ultimately make us feel more lonely. And one of the deadliest feelings for humans is loneliness, because we existed in tribes, and during when we were existing in tribes, being cast out or pushed to the edge of the herd, not belonging to the tribe, meant that you were the first person that was going to get picked off by a predator. So there's a reason that we developed as social animals, and that ability to have rich conversations is fundamental to those connections in today's world. There's a great piece by Sherry Turkle, who's a psychologist and professor at MIT, and the author of a book called Alone Together: Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. And I'm just going to quote a passage from her writing, which I think is really, first, beautifully written, but offers a lot to think about. So, in the silence of connection, people are comforted by being in touch with a lot of people, carefully kept at bay. We cannot get enough of one another, if we can use technology to keep one another at distances we can control. Not too close, not too far, just right. I think of it as the Goldilocks effect. Texting and email and posting let us present the self we want to be. This means we can edit if we wish, we can delete or retouch the voice, the flesh, the face, the body. Not too much, not too little, just right. Human relationships are rich, they're messy and demanding. We have learned the habit of cleaning them up with technology. And the move from conversation to connection is part of this, but it's a process in which we shortchange ourselves. Worse, it seems that over time we stop caring and we forget that there is a difference. We are tempted to think that our little sips of online connection add up to a big gulp of real conversation, but they don't. And having real conversations, teaching students how to have real conversations, that's really the bedrock of reporting, and obviously a 21st century skill that I think is worth having. So to go back to this framework of like why teach journalism, in my mind, when I think about what is journalism at its core, it is the practice of the humanities. It is the intersection of literature, social science, history, art, anthropology, communication skills, political science. It's a vessel that you can use to teach these rich and complex human disciplines. So it can be a vessel to teach those skills that are necessary for adapting to a world that is changing very fast. And the best journalists are great storytellers who I think also think like scientists and historians. The worst journalists, or like the worst form of journalism, if you can even call it that, is something like Twitter. And the reason is because it's not a space for dialogue. It's not a space for understanding, and it's not a space for nuance. It is black and white thinking that really doesn't make us better people. So good journalism is thoughtful and it's looking for truth. And it's not enough to necessarily have someone say, well, person A says it's raining and person B says it's not. Sometimes a good journalist, it needs to open the window and say, like, is it raining or not? Like, go and do an experiment and figure out what is truth. And I think that's one of the major issues with our current media ecosystem, is that in mainstream reporting, there's an obsession with both sides reporting, when not all sides are being honest, and some are being intentionally peddling lies. It's obviously, a different situation in partisan media, which isn't even trying to have any sort of objectivity at all. So that's problematic. But at the same time, we do need a cultivation and curation of diverse viewpoints and experiences, and an understanding of humans and their distinct circumstances. So I don't know, what I think is maybe some sort of a remedy for this is this idea of embracing nuance. And I have under here like kind of a subheading of that humanity is an infinite game. And I thought about going a lot more into the ideas of like infinite games versus finite games, which is a James Carr theory. And Simon Sinek just recently wrote a book that kind of dives into this a little bit deeper. But just to like a kind of a simple definition is that there are finite games where the rules are defined and the goal is to win, and the players are known. So, I mean, a sporting event that we would normally think of. And then there are finite games that are designed to go on forever. And an example of that is, I think, democracy is a really good example of that. I think that's part of why we have the tensions we have right now, because we have some people participating or running for office with the mindset of that this is a finite game. It's just the win and that's it, versus the broader view of that democracy is an infinite game. It's something that we're trying to stay in for as long as possible until eventually, the human race is no longer on this planet, if we can keep it up that long. So the same is true, I think, of humanity, right? Like, we're trying to keep humans on this planet as long as we can and have some sort of order. But in that lens, this idea of embracing nuance. So I think where, most of what we see in our modern media landscape, a lot in the partisan media, is that nuance is not being practiced. So we have silos and echo chambers that exacerbate division. We see us and them thinking, right and wrong, black and white, good and evil. And the ultimate outcome of that is that it leads to self-righteousness. And many media organizations, especially the highly partisan ones, they eventually turn into attack structures where I'm right, you're wrong, my way is the only way. And living in these echo chambers makes us extremely sensitive to disagreement. So one way that you can deal with this, if you can teach people to be open, and this is just a personal example, I have family members that I disagree with politically about lots of different issues. And I have found that if I can come to that conversation with true curiosity as to how they came to their point of view and why that point of view matters to them and a genuine desire to understand, what I find is that we can still disagree on a lot of things, but at some point we're able to find some common ground. And I think that helps us become more interested in that other person's point of view. And I think when we surround ourselves with only people that we agree with, we listen to podcasts we agree with, watch television shows we agree with, read books we agree with, the minute that we encounter a person who says something that we disagree with, we unfollow, it's over, we're moving on. What happens though, the result of that is that we become so sensitive to dissonance. And I think this is part of why it's so essential that we learn this skill of learning from, including, and respecting other points of view. If we can do that, we can create a more complete picture of the world. And if we want to have a stable democracy, this is going to be essential. So some of the places that I see nuance being embraced in journalism, I see it more in some genres than others. Podcasting, I think, is doing a really good job with this in a lot of places. The New York Times has got a really nice portfolio of podcasts. The Daily is one of their most popular. It's one I use with students all the time. I'll require them to listen to certain podcasts. Many of them end up starting to listen to the Daily every single day. And we have, probably multiple conversations a week about a particular story that was on the Daily. Other podcasts in their portfolio that I think are embracing nuance, the Ezra Klein Show. Kara Swisher has a podcast called SWI, if you're interested in more of like tech stuff, but they have a great portfolio of podcasts. Additionally, one other podcast that I just cannot get enough of is, so it's the Armchair Expert sub podcast, which is Expert on Expert. They're both hosted by Dax Shepard, and he is not a journalist by trade, but man, oh man, that man is a great interviewer. And part of the reason he's such a great interviewer is that he is really open, and he's really open and non-judgmental, and he's does a fantastic job of researching the people that he is going to interview before he comes into the interview, and just asks really personal questions about their life and growing up that you wouldn't necessarily get if you're, just reading some short piece. It's just the thing that's so lovely about podcasts is that you can actually hear the host, the journalist, working through ideas in real time. And, I don't think that we often have as much space for allowing people to learn in real time. And I love when I can actually hear somebody doing that. The other thing that if there are, educators in the room, the New York Times offers free accounts for students, and you literally take all their emails and you plug them in, and then they get an email, and they can sign up for free if they would like to, be able to use that as a tool. The podcasts are free though, without having to sign up. So anybody can listen to those. The other place I see nuance is in long form stories. So if you get The Atlantic or ever read anything from The Atlantic, they do a phenomenal job of doing journalistic work that's really nuanced. There's a recent piece by George Packer that I'm going to use with students in the fall. And anything that I'm talking about, by the way, is going to be in that resource document that I'll share with you at the end. So there'll be links to all these podcasts, any articles, any of these thinkers that I'm mentioning. I will link to those things. So if you want to use them with your students, that you were able to find that easily. So from a scholastic journalism perspective, this is the kind of work that we need to be encouraging our students to do. So work that takes a long time, that forces us to think outside our comfort zones and challenges our preconceptions about an issue. So earlier I mentioned the difficulty of both sides reporting, and to be sure, I understand the importance of having objectivity in journalistic work, but we would be fools to think that any of us are objective. So as many of you probably know, the human animal is biased. We are biased by our own interactions and experiences that color our judgments about particular topics. As human animals, we're designed to be biased. It helps us survive. It protects us. We take in the world through experiences, and we react to both danger and positive reinforcement. We also react much more forcefully to danger than to positive reinforcement. So I'll give you two examples here. One is like a food hunter-gatherer example, which is if I am a hunter-gatherer and I eat a mushroom and it makes me terribly sick, I might not even go anywhere near that part of the forest in the future. Now, if I eat a blueberry, stays me, offers me nourishment, I'm not going to have that same emotional response of like, oh my gosh, I will never, ever enter that space anymore. The same is true in relationships. If anybody's familiar with the work of John Gottman, he is the foremost relationship expert probably in the world, and he can watch a couple interact and predict with 90% accuracy after a 10-minute conversation whether or not they're going to get divorced. And one of the most important insights of that research was they went into it looking at like positive and negative interactions between couples. So they literally would bring couples into this lab. They would stay for a 24-hour period and they would just monitor their conversations over this time. They would also check their biometrics and whatnot as they were engaging in conversation. And they went into it thinking, okay, if there's one positive interaction and one negative interaction, that'll balance out. But that is actually a recipe for disaster. What they found is that you actually have to have a baseline of 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interactions, and the top performers had a ratio of about 20-1. Those negative interactions really outweigh those positive interactions. So we are much more likely to react forcefully to negative experiences than positive ones. The other thing to think about too is like from a perspective of teaching and trying to give feedback to students, think about those ratios, right? If I have, 5 times where I was, giving praise or highlighting something that was good or positive that student did versus, and then, hey, I'm going to offer a suggestion. They're going to be much more receptive to that suggestion if you've had those 5 positive interactions and then you have this one interaction that's challenging. So it's just something to keep in mind. But the reality is that these sorts of patterns create biases in us. And the best advice I can give a young reporter is that when you are practicing journalism, you have to be very introspective about who you think, who you are, what you think, what biases do you think you bring to the table, and how can those possibly be playing out in your work. So if you take on a story and you can feel that emotion, that bias creeping in, that you need to go the extra mile to track down another source or challenge your original take on the story. Probably one of my favorite things that students will say is that if they're working on a story, they'll say that didn't go where I expected it to go. It's like, yes, that's great. Go where the story takes you. So don't develop a narrative and then set in the facts that only support your side. If you begin with a preconceived notion of a story and only chase it down that path, it's going to be very difficult to find the truth. And the two biases that we most sort of see play out in this that we have to think about and contend with are our confirmation bias, so seeing what we expect to see, and our desirability bias, which is seeing what we want to see. And to quote Adam Grant, who's an organizational psychologist and New York Times bestselling author, as well as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, he says that these biases don't just prevent us from applying our intelligence, they actually contort our intelligence into a weapon against truth. We find reasons to preach our faith more deeply, prosecute our case more passionately, and ride the tidal wave of our preferred political party. The tragedy is that we're usually unaware of the flaws in our thinking. And Grant, as I understand him and I understand his work, his general purpose is to do research to help make work not suck. So to make jobs more meaningful and motivating. And I think the same principles can be deployed in a classroom, especially ones that run more like a mini organization than a traditional classroom environment. And so in Grant's most recent book, it's called Think Again, which I highly recommend, especially when you're thinking about issues of objectivity or how to help students challenge their bias and even our own personal biases and enter a framework of more objectivity. And the book considers the power of rethinking. And he considers this both a skill and a mindset. So the research shows that most of us talk and think like preachers, prosecutors, or politicians rather than scientists. And we all do this. We all enter into these different categories at one time or another. But to give a short definition for each of the points. So preachers believe what they already know the truth and that their job is to spread it. Prosecutors trying to win an argument and prove their case. Politicians are trying to win your approval and through campaigning and lobbying. And these are three human mindsets that keep us from being willing to rethink something. So if you are if you're in preacher or prosecutor mode, you've already decided that you are right, other people are wrong, and that means they need to change, but I don't need to be self-reflective. Politicians just tell the audience what they want to hear, but are not necessarily changing what they believe. So the better idea is to think like a scientist. And if you are going to think like a scientist, according to Grant, then you are going to, I'm going to put up a little diagram that this is from the book. So that I think kind of illustrates what he's talking about. So if you think like a scientist, you value humility over pride, curiosity over conviction, and you don't let your ideas become your ideals or your identity. And how do you do this? This is really, really hard for people to do. First, if you get into that scientific mindset, so thinking like a scientist involves more than just reacting with an open mind. It means being actively open-minded. It requires for searching for the reasons why I might be wrong, not for reasons why I must be right, and then revising my views based on what I'm learning. So you don't start with answers or solutions, you lead with questions, which is, right, that is the true journalistic mindset, is to lead with questions. So the next part, the next piece of this rethinking cycle is that you have to separate your past predictions and past beliefs from your current reality. You say, I believed this at the time based on the facts I had, rather than this is my belief set and then I can't give this up, right? So you got to be open to seeking more information. And as you acquire more facts, you're going to revise your understanding. And separating your opinion from your identity, this is very difficult for people to do. But if the goal is to seek the truth, and which is what we should want as good journalists, you have to stay flexible in order to get to the truth. Okay, so let's see. When you think about, I'm gonna jump into like a lesson idea. So what's an exercise that you can do with students to get them to encourage them to rethink something? And an exercise, and this is from a psychologist named Mark Leary, and they recommend writing a letter to yourself about a time when you were wrong. So here's kind of the big idea is like, we all make mistakes. Some people are better at learning from your mistakes than others. And the lesson is to try to take the compassion that you would normally extend to other people who need to change their minds and turn that inward towards yourself. So you write a letter to yourself about a false opinion you had, or a time when you were wrong or made a big mistake, and you extend the same kindness and understanding to yourself that you would to a good friend that you cared about. So if your friend came to you with something that they had done wrong, you wouldn't be like, you're a moron, you'll never get anything right. But we say those sorts of things to ourselves, and we can perseverate and dwell on our mistakes, sometimes for years. So if you write a letter and you say, okay, here's what I got wrong, here's what I learned from that experience and how I can prevent it from happening in the future, it becomes a lot easier to take the mistakes you made and grow from them, as opposed to feeling threatened by them. And so as you guys might be gathering here, I think one of the most important things we can be working on with students is encouraging them to have introspection and to help students consider their motivations and their personal why. So the personal why, that's a term coined by Simon Sinek, who wrote the book Start With Why, and also Leaders Eat Last. And this is an exercise I use with students, and I link to it in the resource document. But so you basically, what you do is you trace some high-low experiences of your life, looking to identify patterns. And then as a small group, you have conversations around those moments. And then as a group of three, you help each other try to help the speaker to determine what is their personal why, like what are their personal motivations for why they do the things they do. And this is a really great exercise to do with students. It'll take usually a few class periods, depending on if you have a block schedule or not. But I find that it's something that's great to do in like the first month or so of the classic. You've had a few, icebreaker team building interactions, hopefully by then, so everyone's not completely unfamiliar with each other, but like you do it earlier enough so that you're allowing people the time to do work while they've gone through that process. Okay, so a lot of theory, right? I'm going to show you some examples of some student work that I think really embodies these principles that I'm talking about: embracing nuance, challenging our misconceptions, doing work that's like long and hard and requires a lot of research. This series that we did, we called it the Separate and Unequal series. Where this came from, we went to a lecture at the History Museum by a guy named Colin Gordon, who wrote a book tracing the decline of the St. Louis region, like the city part of the story. And this was, for me, the first time that I had really heard about racial covenants on housing, and then turned out they're all over St. Louis. And I think, so I took students to this lecture, and I think we were all really, it opened our eyes to a world of history that we had not considered before. And we ended up doing a 3-part series, and this was the 3-part series. Well, it ended up years later, we added an additional chapter to the series. But the project was what I ended up focusing on for my thesis, was like literally tracing the practice of how we went from point A to point B and reporting all of these stories and all the interviews we did, and trying to get the human narrative to these policies. So the first chapter was looking at just the legacy of racist housing policy in St. Louis. And then we looked at how these housing policies ultimately are going to lead to the desegregation program, which St. Louis has the largest and longest running desegregation program in the country. Clayton is a participant in this story, and it is currently it's being phased out currently. And so the second part of the series was really focused on how did this desegregation program come into existence, and then like what is the Clayton lens specifically on it? How did it affect our school? And then the third part was looking at the time when this was written in 2017, was looking at like how this program was going to be phased out over time and our current reality. And then 2 years later, I had a couple of school board members that came to meet with me and wanted us to follow up on the previous reporting as the program was winding down, and we did a follow-up piece to that in 2019. So, this was obviously, I mean, I think if I put all the pages together of this, it was probably, could have been 100 pages of reporting at the end of it. It was quite an undertaking. And obviously this was something that, it required a significant amount of time and attention. And this is the kind of journalism that I feel like at the Globe that we do best, that I'm the most proud of, is these long form pieces that require that countless hours of interviewing and research to put all these puzzle pieces together. The other story that I think illustrates the kind of work that we ventured to do, this is probably one of my favorite stories that we've ever done, is one that we called the Gilded Zip Code. And it just looks at all of the benefits that are enshrined in being born into a particular zip code. And so we looked at like the fact that zip codes predict outcomes, and they predict outcomes because there are buckets of resources that are enshrined with just like growing up and living in a particular area. So it's education, neighborhoods, jobs, family, and health. And I think this story also, the conversations we had in the classroom about this story, offering students a real framework to be like, who have grown up their whole lives in Clayton, to say, oh, wow, if I lived in, 63106 versus 63105, my life could look a lot different if that's where I was born and grew up. And so just getting students to really think about the world outside of them, outside of that Clayton bubble, is really, I thought was really powerful. Okay, so some just quick bits of practical advice, and then we can take some questions. So how do you encourage students to do work like this? For me, it's reading a lot, listening to a lot of podcasts. For me, I have to stay inspired. And that helps me inspire my students. So when I read something that I think is really smart, I bring it into the classroom and we have conversations about it. And sometimes I can get a bite, right? They are interested in the topic too, and they kind of think about how could we do this from a Clayton perspective. And so that's part of it. So part of the recipe is just, just that. I think a couple other helpful tips. So one is thinking through with them how pieces are constructed. So if I bring in a really great piece from the Atlantic, asking the questions of how do you think the reporter got that quote from that person? What kind of questions would they have had to ask? Where would they have gotten this like amazing anecdote? They obviously spent a tremendous amount of time with this person. They probably were at their house. They probably did this or that. But so like really trying to get them to pull back the story and say, like, what are the pieces that had to come together to make this happen? They obviously have to write. You can only give feedback on writing when they're turning in writing. So just getting them to write as much as possible. I'm sorry, let's go back here. So a workshop model is helpful. There's lots of workshop models that you can use, but having a common experience for students to like give feedback on other people's work is really helpful. And then offering and organizing mentors. So I do a lot with getting my seniors and juniors to work with my freshmen and sophomores so that not only is there like that intrinsic motivation of, oh, wow, this upperclassman wants to work with me, but it's also the older students have that opportunity to teach, which we know is right. Mastery of a subject is like, I can teach it. And then I thought these were good. This is from a TED Talk by Celeste Headley, who's from an NPR, but she said, these are just tips on having better conversations. And these are my favorite ones from her talk. So first was don't multitask, because if you aren't present, you're wasting your time. So if someone comes in to talk to you and you're half typing on your computer and you don't really turn away or put the technology down, you're not gonna engage fully in a real conversation. You've probably all heard this one before, right? Listening to understand and not to respond. Some of it, we're not very good at that sometimes. 3 is entering every conversation, assuming that you have something to learn. Asking open-ended questions, tell me about, how do you feel about, what was that like? So forcing people not to give you a yes or no answer, but like having to formulate a full thought to respond. Going with the flow. So as someone is responding to you, there are times where ideas are gonna come into your mind that you have to be like, I'm gonna just let that go. I'm not gonna interject that into the conversation because I'm focused on trying to get this person to share with me. And I like this last one, which is just listening. So if your mouth is open, you are not learning. So final thoughts in closing. So what I'm really kind of hoping that you're going to take away from this session is that the best thing we can be teaching students is to be introspective, to think about the issues in a broader framework of humanity, but also how to be open to things that challenge us and to be respectful of others in that process. And it's also really about the importance of being able to have rich human conversations. So to me, being able to teach journalism is using journalism as this great vessel for achieving all of these goals. That's kind of what I got. So we can definitely jump into taking some questions. I'll stop my share.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Erin. I have just been taking so many notes. I don't even teach journalism, but I feel like the perspective that you're offering is just so valuable for us to think about in any kind of writing or in our participation in as citizens of this country. So thank you very much for this deep dive. We do have a question. We have about 9 or 10 minutes, so let's start with the one question that we have. I'll read it aloud. What are, if any, cultural differences in journalism vis-a-vis privacy, etc.? I ask this as an Indian American who has lived in Africa too, and it's almost kaleidoscopal, if this word exists. Same elements, but different patterns when it comes to human behavior. So cultural differences in journalism.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are going to be a lot of cultural differences in journalism. And what are you able to produce, in the United States versus other parts of the world would be vastly different. Being able to report on some of the things that, I mean, we obviously know in certain parts of the world, journalists are being jailed or, taken off of airplanes, most recently that event. where you are not obviously free to cover whatever you want to cover. I think one of the, for me, I love NPR. I think that's one of the better, more, objective, if we're going to use that term, platforms that we have in the United States. And I look at like the BBC. I mean, everywhere in Europe also has some of the same problems that we are facing with nationalism and whatnot, but they really invest in their national media, and we could do a better job of that. But the other thing with NPR is that their funding platform is so good compared to what a lot of other media organizations are doing. So that donation model works fairly well. And the other thing that I really appreciate them is they're very transparent about who's paying the bills. If they're going to run a story about, I'm going to mention Ameren in this story, they're upfront, they're going to say Ameren donates to, or is a sponsor of, so forth and so on. So, like there's definitely cultural differences. There's also just like so many differences in the media, that landscape, that are even just exist here in the United States. There's such a variety of what kind of content is being produced. And that's a huge part of it's can be great in some ways, but it's also problematic. Like it can be great in some ways that obviously then there are nowadays, because of the internet, it would be very difficult to you think about what's happening with the Uyghur Muslims, for example, in China. As much as they would like to suppress, they literally follow American journalist from the airport, follow them all over the place the entire time they're there. As much as they would like to suppress that story, they still can't, and that's one of the benefits of the rise of technology. The downside is that we don't have those common experiences.
Yeah. And I think maybe another part of that question goes to what you spoke about at the very beginning, like what are our common stories? And of course, that varies kaleidoscopically around the world. So yeah, it's a great question. One of the questions I was thinking about is, we've gone through now the year of Zoom teaching. Many of us either are back in the classroom or are anticipating a return to the classroom this fall. And I think so much of what you spoke about today, for me, really is about, it's interesting, it's so much about in-person engagement. It's about having conversations with students that are very personal and attentive and direct. And I don't know if you want to talk about maybe what some of, challenges that you've had that maybe being back in the classroom will help alleviate or help strengthen some of this kind of teaching, where it's not just the assignments and the lessons and the deadlines, but it's really about cultivating like a mindset and, like you say, interiority and reflection and, how to talk to other people and be empathetic, all those things.
Yeah. So, I can definitely speak to that. So, in this year of Zoom teaching, so my program, most of my students, start freshman or sophomore year, and then we'll follow the program for 3 or 4 years. That I had an advantage during Zoom school that very few other teachers had, which is about 75% of my students, I already knew them. And a tool like this, to do a Zoom with students that I already know really well, it's actually not so bad. It's kind of a nice way to connect. But for students, and then obviously this school year, starting in the fall, this crop of this 25% of students that I had never met before, it was very challenging to get to know them. And I ended up scheduling just one-on-one Zoom sessions to say, tell me about your life, tell me about your family, tell me about your interests, just because it was so difficult to even put names and faces together, with the nature of I'm turning my camera on or not on, all of that stuff. So, it's something that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about. How do we kind of gear up to start the next school year? And what we always do a couple days in the summer where we kind of get together and do some planning for the coming school year. And we're going to do that again, but we're going to add kind of 2 additional days before we even start the school year that are just focused on team building, getting to know people, kind of, a boot camp of hitting the ground running, just because I felt like we've missed out on so much of what makes the program so rich. We did the best that we could considering the circumstances, but it was definitely really a challenge. And I could see that divide really starkly with interacting with students that I've known for a very long time and ones that were brand new. Was very different experience.
Yeah. Interesting. So, and the other thing that you shared a lot of wonderful resources, things to introduce into the classroom, and I think that's going to be a great to be, share with this group in the Google Doc. We have one more question. Do you have newspaper in education program here in St. Louis? That's NIE. If not, what sources do you use with the high school students?
Yeah, so we don't use NIE here, but so there is the Journalism Education Association offers curriculum for teachers, and that would be the place that I would go if you are a journalism teacher, wherever you are in the country. The Journalism Education Association will have, especially if you're a new teacher who is, trying to teach this for the first time and trying to kind of figure out the lay of the land. That is a really good resource. The book that I'm not like a big textbook person. I don't use them very often, but the one textbook that I do pull some lessons or nuggets out of, it's a book called The Radical Right, like Right, W-R-I-T-E. And it's by a guy named Bobby Hawthorne, and he's hilarious. He's a really good writer. And it's unlike any textbook you've ever read. You'll walk away being like, I've got good material to go back with. And I leaned on that a lot in the first few years that I was teaching journalism. And then as I kind of got more comfortable in my own skin, I would just pull in any sort of resources that I thought that the students might find engaging, and trying to kind of help them down the path of understanding why it's certain stories or, pieces are really relevant to their lives and their future as American citizens.
Fantastic. So I think we are closing in on closing time. And let's see. I think there's one more question here. I don't know how quickly you can answer it, but then this will be our last one. Is there anything as citizen, is there such a thing as citizen journalists? And what's your opinion of this type of journalism? So not on the professional level.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, right? I mean, there are people who are, I mentioned like Dax Shepard. He's not a trained journalist. The other person that I really just love, there's a woman named Heather Cox Richardson who is
I get her stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, she's from I think Boston University, and historian, but she writes about the news from a historical lens. And she's not a journalist, but by gosh, I mean, it fits right in that bucket. I mean, then also you obviously have people who are, I don't know if you were also kind of thinking that question from a lens of recording something with their cell phone or things like that people obviously do that. I know of high school students that have, gone to protests and are, documenting different things that are happening. And I think those things, I mean, you're not gonna, I think people can offer really amazing contributions, like your Heather Cox Richardson is an amazing contribution to those journalistic conversations. Sometimes it's just really like data output. If you are a citizen journalist, I'm just recording something and I'm putting it out in the universe. I don't know if I would consider that like journalism exactly. It's just like a contribution to like data. But, I think there are some people who are really good at still applying a lot of those principles of journalism that you would want from somebody who's taking an ethical approach, a desire to be a truth teller. At the end of the day, like anybody can be a journalist. You don't need a particular training, but you have to have some adherence to, wanting to find the truth. And if you're doing that, even if you're just not necessarily formally trained, you can absolutely be a great contributor to journalism. I actually tell my students all the time that are going in that might want to be journalists, I'm like, you don't have to major in journalism, major in psychology, major in anthropology, social science. All of those things can make you actually a better journalist by having a different kind of perspective to bring to the table.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. First of all, thanks again to our our audience that came to participate today, and thank you, Erin, so much for so much insight and so many tips. Very, very useful in so many realms, even beyond teaching journalism. So I really appreciate your time, and thank you for being with us. And we'll say goodbye. Until next time, please, for people in the audience, please check out the rest of our free public programs, which continue through the end of the month, every weekend. Thank you. Bye.